Welcome to the next session in the Sustainability Improvement Planning Series on how to reduce environmental impacts while saving money and improving the workplace, also known as the triple bottom line. Today's video is a primer on encouraging change and how to write the change management chapter of your sustainability improvement proposal. By the end of this session, you will be able to identify resistance to change, identify ways to reduce organizational and behavioral resistance, and develop an action plan based on change theory. So, how do you get people to willingly make a change? The first step in creating change in an organization is to take a good look at the reasons for resistance to change that you may encounter. One of the best tools for doing that is a force field analysis, originally developed by Kurt Lewin. To do it, write a question on the top of a piece of paper or flip chart or a whiteboard, such as, what are the driving forces and restraining forces that can affect the changes we are trying to make? Draw a large T on the paper or board below the question. On one side, above the horizontal line that makes up the T, write driving forces, and on the other side, write restraining forces. Brainstorm each side of the T-chart. These should be two independent lists. There is no need to have a restraining force for each driving force. Once you have a good list on each side of the T, between 6 and 12 forces on each side, take each one and ask yourself whether it's a strong force, a moderate force, or a weak one. Draw an arrow under each one, a long arrow for a strong force, medium arrow for moderate force, and a short arrow for a weak force. This management tool works because it is very visual and it helps you focus your efforts to understand potential resistance to change. Resistance to change is a thorny problem, and you should examine some change theories for ideas on how to improve your chances. In the second section of the chapter, explain your approach to change. There are a lot of change theories you can find. Use one that explains how to make the types of change you want to make. We'll cover several here. Let's start with organizational development, also known as OD. OD is an approach that aligns beautifully with sustainability because it's very holistic. OD is a very deliberate, scientific, planned, and systematic approach to improving effectiveness. It seeks to align different aspects of the organization, like strategy, processes, and people, so you reduce or eliminate the cognitive dissonance that happens when parts of the organization are at odds with one another. Because values, beliefs, and attitudes can affect the success of an organization, training becomes an important component of organizational development. Training highlights the positive aspects of an organization's strategy that are in alignment with people's values and beliefs. Positive attitudes will result when people feel their interests are aligned with the organization. Because OD is holistic, it looks at all levels of the organization: individual, team, intergroup, and systematic improvements. And it identifies potential changes that can be made in each of these levels in almost every aspect you can think of: technical, product, behavioral, cultural, and structural. Briefly, let's go over each one. First, technical. OD looks for technical changes to individual jobs to make them better, faster, and easier. It looks at technical support for teams to improve quality control. It looks to improve the technology between groups to smooth communication. And it researches whether there is a major technical redesign that will help operations of the entire system. In the product area, OD encourages individual innovation. It may use synectics or other techniques to isolate a team in a creative environment to encourage making unique connections. It may take a systematic strategic planning approach to design new products. Or it may take a total paradigm shift to provide customers with products they didn't even know that they wanted or needed. Behavioral changes focus on identifying needs at each level of the organization. Individuals are encouraged to develop themselves. OD uses team building activities and facilitators to support team development. It uses events and outside consultants to help groups communicate with each other, and it can use data to make continuous improvements. An organization's culture can be supportive or destructive to its success. At the very beginning of an employee's tenure, explain culture through a new employee orientation. Team development activities can focus on getting their buy-in on the organization and its plans, which can create an upward spiral. Stories and a company vision can help create a positive culture throughout the organization. Finally, structural changes can ensure that all levels are trained and empowered to make decisions that can carry the changes forward. Here's a handy matrix that compiles all of the ideas discussed here. Many of the sustainable ideas you want to do in the workplace require people changing the way they do things. But it's often quite difficult to make that happen. So what can you do to encourage more sustainable behaviors? We're going to look at 3 theories of behavior change, along with some practical actions that you can consider. Each situation is a bit different, and there are no cookie-cutter solutions. You need to observe and evaluate what your situation is and what approach would work best. The first theory is based on behaviorism, that we tend to seek pleasure and avoid pain, and we can use positive and negative consequences to shape behavior. This theory has the most immediate effect if it's done correctly, but you want to make sure that you are transparent and not manipulative in what you are doing. There are 4 characteristics to consequences that make them more or less effective in shaping behavior. Whether the consequences are positive or negative. Immediate, giving instant feedback, or distant, giving the consequences sometime in the future. Whether the consequences are certain or uncertain, and whether they are important to the person or irrelevant. Next is a strategic approach that you can take. The positive adaptation cycle is great to use when embarking on a major shift in the organization's sustainability efforts. The premise of this approach is that change evokes the same reactions as grief. But can you interrupt the grief cycle, at least in the context of organizational change? First, let's take a look at the grief cycle. The initial reaction is shock, followed by denial that the change is happening, then a feeling of guilt, either that you could have changed earlier or reacted better to the change, then anger at the company, at other people, at the country, then bargaining, and finally acceptance and recovery. You end up at a place that is sometimes a bit lower than before. Now let's take a look at a more strategic approach. First, get employees together to process their feelings. Then acknowledge that there was nothing wrong with the old way of doing things, but now we have to explore a new context. Then reaffirm values, which have not changed, and reestablish the vision. Finally, allow the employees to look for opportunities to reach the company's goals. The last approach we'll take a look at is switch. The fact is, most people don't change their behavior based on logic. Change needs 3 things to support it: logic, feeling, and direction. The authors compare it to an elephant with a rider. The rider is the rational mind, the elephant is emotion, much larger and more difficult to steer, and finally we need a path for the elephant and the rider to follow. First, direct the rider. The rider is critical to providing direction. One way is to give the rational mind a good example of the change you are seeking, called follow the bright spots. Another is to script the critical moves to give the rational mind specific steps to make the change. Finally, giving the rational mind a destination can keep it from getting bogged down. The second element of the framework is the elephant in the room. There are 3 ways you can reach the elephant. The first is to find the feeling. When people are excited and hopeful, they gladly make the change. Second is to shrink the change. When change seems big, it can be overwhelming. Finally, you may need to grow your people so people can be successful at each step of the change. The last element of the change framework is to shape the path, to remove obstacles that might slow or prevent change. First, tweak the environment to make the change easier to accomplish. Then, it's important to build habits so the change becomes second nature. Finally, you can rally the herd. If surrounded by enthusiastic adopters of the change, it'll be easier to make the decision to change. The third part of the chapter looks at an action plan. You will want to brainstorm actions that you can take to strengthen the driving forces and reduce the greatest restraining forces based upon the change theory that you believe applies. First, identify the weaker driving forces and the stronger restraining forces. Then create a table, and in the first column put increased driving forces and reduce restraining forces with a space for a list of actions under each one. In the next 2 columns put by whom and when. Reserve the last column for later evaluating whether your action made a difference. Next, apply the organizational or behavioral change theory to increase the smallest driving forces and reduce the largest restraining forces. Some of the suggestions for strengthening driving forces and reducing restraining forces will be easy, tangible steps. Most will involve education, training, and persuasion. What do you think would work in your organization? Record the possible actions addressing each force. This will become the basis for your action plan. So in summary, we've reviewed 3 steps in change management that make up the chapter template. The force field analysis, identifying the driving forces and restraining forces for change. Then we looked at several change management theories that can give you a good approach to managing change. And finally, we discussed an action plan in which you will be applying the change. Now it's your turn. Given that you want your organization to be more sustainable, how would you encourage people to adopt greener behaviors? Draft the change management chapter for your sustainability improvement plan.